Garrison Pruitt has a kitchen table in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and on that table, for the better part of 3 days while I was there, were topographic maps. Not one map. 7 of them, overlapping at the edges, weighted at the corners with coffee mugs and a box of mechanical pencils, covering a section of the American Southwest, roughly the size of Portugal. On each map, at specific coordinates Pruitt had recorded in handwritten field logs going back to the summer of 1979, there were marks, small red circles, drawn in a Sharpie he kept capped on the windowsill above the sink. Some of those circles were clustered, 3 or 4 of them sharing a county, sometimes sharing a drainage basin. Some were solitary, isolated incidents 20 or 30 miles from the nearest other mark. But when you stepped back from the table far enough to stop seeing individual circles and start seeing the shape they formed together, something became apparent that no individual data point could show you on its own. Before I get into what Garrison Pruitt found, and into what happened to the evidence he spent decades collecting, I want to ask you to subscribe if you have not already. We put significant time into researching and documenting these cases, and if this kind of material matters to you, subscribing is the best way to make sure you do not miss the next one. Hit the button, leave a comment below telling us which part of this you find hardest to explain, and let's get into it. The marks moved. Not randomly, the way scattered incidents might appear to move if you were forcing a pattern onto noise. They moved directionally, north and slightly northeast from March through June, climbing in elevation as summer deepened. Then a reversal in late August and early September, the marks appearing further south and at lower elevation, returning by November to the borderland lowlands near Mexico. And from roughly December through the end of February, almost nothing at all, year after year. For 40 years. Garrison Pruitt spent 37 years as a wildlife biologist, first with the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, and later as research faculty in the Department of Fish, Wildlife and Conservation Ecology at New Mexico State University. He has published peer-reviewed work on pronghorn antelope habitat use in the Chihuahuan Desert, on mountain lion territory dynamics in the Sacramento Mountains, and on livestock depredation rates across Otero and Hidalgo counties. He has a paper from 2007 in the Southwestern Naturalist, which is the journal of record for vertebrate biology in the American Southwest. He is not, in 37 years of professional practice, a person who uses dramatic language or reaches conclusions before the data warrants them. When I asked him what he believed the marks on his maps represented, he stood at the table for a moment and said, "A territory circuit, a seasonal route. Something that is here in spring and north by summer and back south again by fall, using the same corridor for longer than I have been tracking it, and almost certainly longer than that." He did not use the word most people would use. In 37 years of documentation, he has never put that word in a field log. I found him through a letter. In the spring of 2019, Pruitt had written to New Mexico Wildlife, the quarterly publication of the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first described, in measured and carefully non-sensational terms, a 40-year data set of anomalous livestock predation incidents in the Chihuahuan Desert region with consistent wound morphology and a spatial clustering pattern that he characterized as directional and seasonal. The second paragraph noted that he had published on the dataset in 2007 and that he believed the data warranted continued monitoring, though he offered no specific recommendation and no agency to address the recommendation to. The letter was signed with his name, his retired NMSU affiliation, and a phone number in Las Cruces. He told me later he had not been sure why he wrote it. He had been retired for 3 years, and the material had been sitting in the cabinet in his study, and the letter seemed like a reasonable thing to do with it. The editor of New Mexico Wildlife forwarded the letter to me after deciding it fell outside the magazine's scope. I called the number in Las Cruces that same week. Pruitt answered on the second ring and said he had been expecting someone to call, by which he meant not me specifically, but the general category of a person who would call. He was not surprised, and he was not reluctant. He told me I was welcome to come down and look at the maps. I drove to Las Cruces from Albuquerque on a Monday in October, the Rio Grande Valley narrowing as the highway descended from the high desert plateau toward the basin. Pruitt's house is in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of the city, close enough to the Oregon mountains that you can see their jagged ridge from the back porch on clear days. He met me at the door in work clothes, a man in his early 70s with the deliberate movements of someone who has spent his career outdoors and still moves that way out of habit. The maps were already on the kitchen table. He had set them out before I arrived. Pruitt grew up in Deming, in Luna County, New Mexico, which sits in the Chihuahuan Desert at roughly 4,400 feet elevation. His father ran cattle on leased state land east of town. He told me that growing up beside a cattle operation gave him a specific and practically involuntary relationship to livestock mortality. He developed a tolerance for it the way a person develops tolerance for any recurring exposure, until it registered as a category of information rather than an event. By the time he started graduate work in wildlife biology at NMSU in the mid-70s, he estimated he had seen close to 200 coyote kills. He processed each one the way a diagnostician processes a symptom, methodically and without inflection, cataloging what it told him about the animal responsible. He joined the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish in 1979, assigned as a junior biologist to the Southwestern District. In practical terms, this meant primary responsibility for Hidalgo County, the far southern portions of Grant and Luna counties, and intermittent coverage into northern Donna Ana County. This is some of the most remote terrain in the continental United States. The Animas Valley in Hidalgo County has no incorporated town. The community called Animas has a post office, a bar, and a population that has never approached 1,000. The Animas Mountains to the east and the Peloncillo Mountains to the west bracket a broad grassland valley that functions ecologically much as it did before Euro-American settlement. Pronghorn antelope move through it seasonally. Mountain lions work the upper reaches of both ranges. The Malpai Borderlands, a conservation area spanning nearly 800,000 acres across the New Mexico-Arizona-Sonora border, begins at the southwestern edge of this territory and extends into Mexico with no meaningful interior fencing. It is, in biological terms, one of the most intact semi-arid grassland systems left in North America. Pruitt spent 6 years learning it by walking it, in all seasons, under all weather conditions, which is the only way to learn terrain you are going to rely on professionally. He told me that in his first 3 years on the job, he had no cases that gave him pause. Standard predation, standard documentation, standard reporting to the district office. He was building the baseline understanding of predator behavior in his coverage area that would make the deviation, when it appeared, immediately recognizable. The first anomalous kill he documented was in August of 1981. Cordell Reyes ran sheep on about 4,000 acres east of Animas, land his family had worked since the 1930s. He was in his mid-50s at the time, a reserved man who did not call the district office lightly, and when he called to report 3 ewes dead in a pasture, he did it without editorial comment. 3 down, throat area, no blood visible, no tracks. Pruitt drove out the following morning. It was 45 miles of paved road and 12 miles of 2-track from the district office, and he arrived in the early afternoon. He spent 2 hours at the site, and he told me there were several things wrong within the first 10 minutes. The first was the absence of blood. Coyote predation leaves blood at the kill site. Sometimes not a great deal, depending on the size of the animal and how long scavengers have had at it, but the blood is there. On the ground, on the fleece, visible under the animal when you roll it. These 3 ewes had none. The ground around them was undisturbed. He lifted the nearest one by the wool to check the underside and found nothing. He looked at the second and the third. He had to part the wool at the throat to find the marks, and when he did, he stopped and looked at them for a long moment before he continued. 2 small holes, roughly circular, close together, perhaps 1.5 inches between centers. The skin at the margins of each wound was intact and clean, no tearing, no bruising, no evidence of the grasping and shaking a canid attack produces. The punctures had clean edges, the tissue at the rim compressed rather than torn, which is consistent with penetration rather than laceration. He measured the diameter of each puncture with a steel rule from his kit, approximately 5 millimeters. He checked all 3 animals. All 3 had an identical pair of marks. 2 had the marks at the throat. 1 had them at the base of the skull. The wound pair seated precisely at the occipital junction. The same 5 millimeter diameter, the same clean margins. He noted, in his field log, that the wounds looked like a process rather than an injury. He used those exact words, a process, something deliberate and repeatable. Each animal was fully exsanguinated. A Rambouillet ewe in good condition carries 4 to 5 liters of blood. He formed this conclusion from the visual absence of blood at the site, the pallor of the exposed tissue at the wound margins, and the condition of the carcasses, which felt deflated when he handled them, less the density you expect from a recently dead animal, and more like weight without substance. He wrote, "Complete apparent exsanguination, blood volume unaccounted for at kill site" in his field log. This was a notation he would use 88 more times over the next 4 decades. The smell reached him before he had been at the site 5 minutes. Sulfur, faint and chemical, with a secondary note he described to me as something between antiseptic and ozone. He had encountered something similar near geothermal surface activity in the Black Range, and the association was close enough that he wrote it down. He was not sure what to make of it. He recorded it, along with the wind direction, and moved on. He collected tissue samples from the wound margins on 2 of the 3 animals, sealed them in evidence bags from his field kit, and drove them to Deming, where he put them on ice before the next morning's courier run to the NMDGF Wildlife Laboratory in Albuquerque. He called Cordell Reyes from the road to report his findings, which at that stage were findings and not conclusions. Reyes told him 2 things Pruitt had not asked about. The first was that his Blue Heeler, a 6-year-old dog that had worked the property through 4 prior seasons and was reliable around the stock, had not barked during the night. Not once. The Heeler was alive and physically uninjured the next morning, but she had stayed in the house for 3 days following and could not be induced to go near the pasture where the ewes had been found. She stopped eating normally for about a week. She worked again after that, but Reyes said she never worked that particular pasture again without what he described as checking the edges before she went in, a behavior she had not shown before. The second thing Reyes said was that the losses were not entirely a surprise, by which he meant that he had heard of similar losses on neighboring properties over the years, losses that nobody talked about much because talking about them produced nothing useful. He named 2 ranches. He did not elaborate. Pruitt drove to both properties the following week. The first ranch was owned by a man named Hargrove, who had been running cattle in the valley for 20 years and had experienced what he described as 2 or 3 incidents per year of the type Reyes had described, going back to the late 1970s, the year before Pruitt's coverage period began. He had not reported any of them. He said reporting was not something he did in general, that he had grown up in a family that resolved its own problems, and that asking a government agency to document a livestock loss that the agency would then do nothing about was a way of making work for yourself without improving your buyer situation. He was not unfriendly about it. He let Pruitt look at a back pasture where he said a loss had occurred 6 weeks prior. The carcass was gone, composted. He described the wound profile from memory, and the description matched. Pruitt noted the coordinates, the date range, and Hargrove's account in the dedicated log. The second ranch had changed hands the previous year. The new owners were a young couple from Albuquerque who knew nothing of previous losses. Pruitt left his district office number and asked them to call if they found anything unusual. They called twice over the next 3 years. Both calls were standard coyote losses. The laboratory results came back 3 weeks later. The bite morphology did not correspond to any canid species in the reference database. The wound diameter was too small and too precise for coyote predation. The twin puncture pattern did not match any documented mountain lion, bobcat, or bear attack. The wound angle was inconsistent with any documented ambush predation technique in the regional fauna. The lab report used the phrase bite morphology, atypical of all known regional predator species, and recommended submission to a specialist for further review. Pruitt forwarded the recommendation to the district office. The district office acknowledged receipt. Nothing came of it. He filed the report, noted in his personal records that the laboratory recommendation had been forwarded without result, and went on to the next call. The NMDGF district office, for its part, was not a large operation. The southwestern New Mexico district in 1981 had 3 field biologists covering an area of roughly 14,000 square miles, which is somewhat smaller than Switzerland. The caseload was weighted toward game management, deer and elk population surveys, illegal hunting enforcement, and standard livestock predation assessment. An anomalous livestock kill with unusual wound morphology was a low-priority item in that context. Pruitt understood this. He had no expectation that the forwarded laboratory recommendation would produce a specialist assignment or a formal follow-up program. He filed it because filing it was the correct procedure. He also understood, from the first case forward, that if this pattern was going to be documented, he was going to be the one doing it. The next anomalous case came 14 months later, in October of 1982, from a rancher 60 miles north in the foothills of the Black Range in Sierra County. 4 goats dead, same wound profile, paired circular punctures at the throat, complete exsanguination, no blood at sight. He drove out, documented, collected samples. He referenced the Animas Valley case number in his report and noted that the wound morphology was consistent. The lab confirmed consistency. The report went into the file. He told me that after the second case, he began paying closer attention to the geography. The 2 cases were separated by 60 miles of mostly low-elevation desert terrain. They were not in adjacent counties. They had no ranching or land use connection. What they had in common was elevation. Both were at or above 4,500 feet, in terrain with access to mountain cover within a few miles of the kill site. He also began paying attention to the calls he was not receiving. Livestock predation in rural New Mexico is chronically underreported. Ranchers who call the district office are the exceptions. Most absorb losses quietly, either from self-reliance or from prior experience of reporting producing nothing. He started keeping track of informal mentions, a neighbor telling a rancher about something that happened to someone else, a comment at a feed store or a county extension meeting. He began visiting ranches in his coverage area that he had not had a call from, on the pretext of routine predator assessment, and asking whether they had seen anything unusual. Over the course of 83 and 84, he collected 5 additional cases that way. Ranchers who had the wound profile animals in their fields had noted the absence of blood and had not called anyone. In 3 of those 5 cases, the ranchers had buried or composted the carcasses within a day or 2 of finding them. He could not collect samples. He recorded the geographic coordinates, the date, and the verbal description of the wound profile from each rancher's account, and he put them in the dedicated log that he had started keeping separately from the official district records. The dedicated log began as a standard hardcover field notebook he bought at a hardware store in Deming. He wrote the case date and coordinates on the inside cover. By the end of 1984, it held 14 cases. By the end of 85, it held 20. In 1984, he drove out to the Animas Valley to document a new case on Pauline Archuletta's property. She was a widow in her 70s who ran sheep on land her late husband's family had homesteaded in the 1920s. She had not called the district office about this particular loss. Her neighbor had mentioned it to Pruitt at a county meeting. He drove out and documented the kill, 3 ewes with the same wound profile, and afterward sat with Pauline Archuleta in her kitchen and drank coffee and asked her whether she'd seen anything like this before. She said yes, periodically, going back to the 1960s. She had stopped reporting losses of this kind because reporting had never produced a useful result. Her family had a name for them. She said it in Spanish, los que no sangran, the ones that don't bleed. She said her family had used that phrase since she was a child, which put it at minimum into the 1940s, possibly earlier, given that her parents would have heard it from their parents. She did not know of any written record of the phrase or of the losses it described. She said it was simply understood within families who had ranched that valley long enough. Pruitt wrote her words in his field log, exactly as she said them. He did not ask her to elaborate on what she believed caused the losses. He thanked her and drove back to Deming. He has described that kitchen conversation to me in more detail than almost any other single event in the 40-year record. The kitchen itself he remembers specifically, a small room with a propane range and a window over the sink that looked out toward the Animas Mountains, a shelf of religious figures above the doorway, a calendar from a feed supplier in Lordsburg on the wall. Pauline Archuleta had made coffee before he arrived, a large pot, and she poured for both of them without asking. She sat across the table from him with her hands around her mug, and she was not uncomfortable with the subject. She had clearly thought about it, or had been in proximity to people thinking about it for long enough that the thinking had settled into something quieter than anxiety. She was not afraid. She was matter-of-fact about it the way a person is matter-of-fact about a condition they have lived with long enough that the strangeness has worn off and only the fact remains. He asked her whether her family had ever tried to do anything about the losses. She said, "What would you do?" It was not a question, she said. You account for it, and you keep going. That is what you do with things you cannot resolve. He wrote that in the log as well, not as a data point but as a note to himself, the kind of note a field biologist makes when a conversation contains something worth keeping, even if it does not belong in a report. Pauline Archuleta died in 1998. He attended the funeral. He told me, on one of the evenings I spent at his house, that he thinks about her account more than any other single piece of information in his data set. It is not data in any formal sense. It is one person's recollection of a family oral tradition, uncorroborated, collected 14 years after the most recent event she described. He would never include it as an evidence point in a scientific paper, but he also cannot dismiss it. If she was accurate, and if her parents and grandparents were using that phrase before she was born, then what is on his maps predates his documentation by at minimum 2 generations. It was here before he was, and it will almost certainly be here after him. He added a notation to his log after her funeral. Archuleta oral account, Animas Valley. Family usage of descriptive phrase documented into at least 1940s, possibly earlier. Cannot confirm. Including for completeness. The phrase itself stayed with him in a way he found hard to articulate. He told me that the naming of something, in a context where you have no formal explanation for it, is its own kind of knowledge. Pauline Archuleta's family did not know what caused the bloodless losses. They had no theory, or at least none that she shared with Pruitt. What they had was a description that was accurate enough to be passed across generations, and that distinguished the anomalous kills from ordinary predation without requiring an explanation of the mechanism. He has spent 37 years building the most detailed documentation of those losses that exists, and the best summary he can offer of what the documentation shows is not substantially more informative than the phrase her family used. The 1989 Sacramento Mountains case was the one that mattered most in terms of evidence, and it is the one whose evidence is now gone. He received a call in early October of that year from the Otero County Extension Office, which had fielded a report from a sheep rancher working land in the Lincoln National Forest buffer zone in the high country east of Cloudcroft. Cloudcroft sits at roughly 8,600 feet in the Sacramento Mountains in southern New Mexico. The kill site was at a somewhat lower elevation, around 6,200 feet, in a mixed zone of pine-on-pine, juniper, and oak scrub on a south-facing slope. It was the highest elevation kill site in his data set to that point. He drove up from the desert floor the following morning, a 2-hour climb in elevation from his base territory to the mountain country. He arrived just after sunrise. The air was cold enough that his breath fogged and the grass was still rigid with overnight frost. He found the rancher, a man he is careful not to name in any context because the man's family still works that land, and he made a specific request for privacy, waiting at the gate to the upper pasture. 7 sheep dead, same profile as every prior case in his log. Paired circular punctures, clean margins, complete exsanguination, no blood at sight. 4 of the 7 had the marks at the throat, 2 had them at the base of the skull, and 1 had them at the throat but on the left side only, a variation he had not documented before and has not documented since. He measured the wound diameter on each, 5 millimeters, consistent across all 7. He took the throat angle measurements on the 4, with bilateral throat wounds, using a field protractor, and recorded them, approximately 40 degrees of declination from horizontal, bilateral, accessing the jugular and carotid vessels on both sides of the neck simultaneously. 40 degrees is worth stopping on. An ambush predator attacking from behind and above, which is the standard approach for mountain lion predation, produces a bite angle consistent with downward force, typically 10 to 20 degrees. A canid attacking at the throat from the side produces a horizontal or near horizontal bite. 40 degrees from horizontal, bilateral, does not correspond to any predation approach in the regional literature. It corresponds to something approaching from in front and slightly below, which is not a posture any known large carnivore in North America adopts for prey of this size. When Pruitt described this to me, he went into the study and came back with a veterinary anatomy reference, a large format volume on domestic ungulate physiology that he had kept from his graduate coursework. He opened it to the cervical vascular plate and set it on the table between us. The jugular vein runs along the lateral surface of the neck, accessible at a near horizontal approach. The carotid artery runs deeper, medially, and accessing it bilaterally in a single action from outside the body requires a precise angular approach that reaches both vessels simultaneously. He traced the angles on the diagram with a pencil. He said, "At 40 degrees, you are threading the approach between the trachea at the center and the jugular at the side, reaching the carotid at depth on both sides simultaneously. It is not an approach you arrive at by instinct. It is an approach that works every time, only if you have done it long enough to have reduced it to a reflex." He tapped the page once and closed the book and put it back in the study. He collected tissue samples from the wound margins on 3 of the 7 animals. He sealed, labeled, and packed them carefully. He requested that the samples be sent not only to the NMDGF Wildlife Laboratory in Albuquerque, but forwarded to the Museum of Southwestern Biology at the University of New Mexico for independent morphological and genetic analysis. The Museum of Southwestern Biology maintains one of the most comprehensive vertebrate specimen collections in the American Southwest and has laboratory capabilities exceeding what the state facility could bring to an unusual case. His forwarding request was written, formal, and included in the case documentation. The NMDGF lab acknowledged receipt of the samples and acknowledged his forwarding request. He waited 3 years without receiving results from MSB. In 1992, he followed up with the state lab. He was told the analysis was ongoing and that MSB had not yet returned results. He noted this in his log. In 1994, he followed up again, this time because he was preparing a summary document of his anomalous case files and wanted to include the MSB findings. The state lab's response informed him that the tissue samples from the '89 Sacramento Mountains case had been destroyed per the standard 5-year retention policy for biological evidence. The samples had arrived in October of '89. The 5-year mark fell in October of '84. I asked him to say that again when he told me. He repeated it the same way. The samples arrived in October of '89. They were destroyed in October of '84. He corrected himself. October of '94, he said. The 5-year mark, precise to the month. He sat with that for a moment before continuing. He asked the state lab whether the samples had been forwarded to MSB prior to destruction, which had been his standing request. There was no record in the file of any forwarding. His original forwarding request was there. The response to that request was not. He spent 2 weeks in the fall of '94 trying to reconstruct what had happened and got no resolution. He filed the full correspondence in his dedicated log, where it remains. He is careful, when discussing the samples, to enumerate the possible explanations. Institutional record-keeping fails. Retention policy enforcement is sometimes rigidly literal. 5 years is 5 years. A low-priority case from a peripheral district does not necessarily stay active in anyone's mind. He says all of this clearly and without apparent reluctance. He then does not revisit it. The maps. The current version of Pruitt's base map is a composite drawn from GIS software, last updated in 2019 when he made the decision to stop adding data. It covers a north-south span from the Mexican border in southern Hidalgo County to the Mogollon Mountains in Catron County, a distance of roughly 240 miles. The east-west span runs from the Black Range in Sierra County to the Arizona state line, approximately 160 miles. On this map, 91 incidents are plotted, each marked with the case reference number from the dedicated log, the date, and a color code corresponding to season: red for spring, blue for summer, orange for fall, and green for winter. There are 4 green marks in 40 years. All 4 are in the same location, the extreme south of the Animas Valley, within 10 miles of the Mexican border, in December or January. He told me the first thing to understand about the winter marks is what they indicate about habitat use. High desert at 4,000 feet is cold in January. Not bitterly so, but cold enough. The montane zones where the summer cases cluster are significantly colder. If what he has been tracking is an endotherm, a warm-blooded animal, you would expect it to seek lower elevation in winter, as mountain lions and black bears do. The 4 winter cases at the border edge are consistent with that. What they suggest is that the animal, or animals, moves to the southern lowlands in winter, and that the Malpai borderlands and the adjacent Sonoran-Chihuahuan transition zone function as a kind of holding ground during the cold months. He tapped the border area on the map and said, "It may cross. It may spend December and January in Sonora or Chihuahua. His coverage area does not extend south of the border. Whatever happens there is outside his data." The second feature of the maps is the elevation gradient. If you trace the spring cases starting from the lowest elevation incidence in Dona Ana County in March and move your finger north and upslope through April into the Otero County foothills and then into the Sacramento Mountains proper in May and June, you are following a line that climbs from roughly 3,800 feet to over 7,000. In summer, the cases are concentrated in the high country, the Sacramentos, the Black Range, and the Mogollon Mountains, all of which sit above 7,000 feet at their higher reaches. In September, the cases appear again in the Otero County foothills, between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. By October, they are back in Hidalgo County and the lowlands near the border. That is the circuit as Pruitt mapped it, 240 miles from south to north and back again, following elevation, the way large mammals follow elevation when they shift between winter and summer range. He let me trace it with my finger on the map twice before he said anything else about it, and I understood why he waited. You need to see the shape of it before the explanation lands. He said, "The most extensive altitudinal migration documented for any individual mammal in the American Southwest is the pronghorn antelope circuit in the greater Yellowstone region, which covers roughly 150 miles round trip for a herd, not an individual. Individual mountain lions in good habitat have territories of 50 to 150 square miles. A large male grizzly might range over 500 square miles in a season, but the Chihuahuan Desert has not had grizzly bears since the mid-20th century. The circuit on those maps is 480 miles round trip, more than 3 times the outer documented limit for any individual large mammal doing seasonal range shift in this part of the continent." Then he said, "Which is why I have never ruled out the possibility of more than one, a social unit, a family group. Several individuals independently using the same established route, the way different mountain lions sometimes use the same corridor between territories without overlapping. His data cannot distinguish between one animal making this circuit and a small number of animals using the same corridor in sequence. What the data shows is that the kill signature is identical across 40 years and across the full 240 miles of the route. Whatever is making these kills is doing it with the same technique in the same way every time, whether in the Animas Valley or in the Mogollon High Country, 300 miles to the north. That kind of consistency is either a single organism with a fixed, specialized behavior or multiple organisms that share it. He prefers to state what the data shows and stop there. The kill density. Over 40 years, his documented dataset averages roughly 2.5 anomalous cases per year across the full coverage area. He has no illusion that this represents the actual total. His coverage was never complete, his rancher network was never comprehensive, and the underreporting problem that he encountered from the beginning never fully resolved itself. If you doubled his figure, 5 cases per year is a number that begins to approach plausibility as an actual total for the corridor. A resident mountain lion averages 30 to 50 large prey kills per year within a territory of 100 square miles. Whatever Pruitt has been tracking is killing, by his best estimate, at roughly 1/10 that rate across a corridor 20 times larger. The footprint is extremely light. He made a point of this during our second afternoon. He said, if this animal, or these animals, were killing at normal large predator rates, we would know about it. The livestock losses would be catastrophic and sustained. County extension offices would have organized response programs. The pattern would have forced itself into visibility. The reason it has not is that it takes very little, very rarely, across a very large area, and moves before the pattern can be corroborated at any single location. It has been here for the length of my documentation, almost certainly longer, precisely because it does not create the kind of crisis that demands a resolution. He was not offering this as a comforting observation. The wound signature, when Pruitt describes it, sounds different from how it is typically discussed. He is a biologist. He does not use the language of horror or mystery. He uses the language of mechanism. He has photographs, in his case, files from across the full 40-year dataset. The early ones developed from film at a 1-hour photo in Las Cruces. The prints slightly faded now, but clear. The later ones, digital. He laid 6 of them on the table across 2 afternoons, and the consistency across 40 years of photographs is something that takes a moment to process. The wound diameter varies slightly across the sample, a function of the size of the animal being killed, but it centers tightly around 5 millimeters. The bilateral placement is consistent. 2 punctures, one accessing the jugular and carotid on each side of the neck simultaneously. At the 40-degree angle he first documented in the Sacramento Mountains in '89, he used the word efficient. He used it more than once, and he meant it precisely. Efficiency in predation is a product of specialization, and specialization is a product of evolutionary time or of learning sustained over a long individual life. A generalist predator improvises. The wound profile varies depending on circumstances, the age and size and behavior of the prey, the terrain, the predator's condition. A specialist uses the same approach every time because the approach has been refined to work reliably under all conditions. The wounds in his photographs do not look improvised. They look like what a process looks like when it has been reduced to its essential minimum. He said, "Whatever makes these wounds has done it for a very long time." I'm going to pause here for a moment. We've covered the full shape of what Garrison Pruitt found. 40 years of data. The kill signature as a biologist reads it. The migration circuit on 7 overlapping topographic maps, and what the data implies about the scale and duration of this thing operating in the Chihuahuan Desert corridor. When we come back, I want to go into what happened in the field beyond the wound documentation, what the ranchers who cooperated with him experienced directly, what his published paper produced in response, and the one evening in 37 years that he saw something that was not a dead livestock animal, the scavenger avoidance. He documented it first in 1983 and noted it in most subsequent cases where he arrived at the site within 24 hours. Vultures circled kill sites but did not land on the carcasses. Flies were present at the site but not on the animals. Coyotes, which are reliable scavengers and typically arrive at a carcass within hours of death under normal conditions in this part of the desert, were absent from anomalous kill sites when he arrived, and in cases where he waited at a distance and observed for an extended period, the coyotes he eventually saw approach the site, stopped short, circled the perimeter at 20 or 30 yards, and left without feeding. In the summer of 2001, he spent 4 hours at a kill site on the Trujillo property, specifically to document scavenger behavior. He had arrived at 7 in the morning, before heat built into the valley, and set up a folding chair and a spotting scope at the uphill edge of the pasture, approximately 100 yards from the 2 dead ewes. He had a notebook and he logged everything he observed in 15-minute intervals. The first vulture appeared overhead at 8:40. By 9:30 there were 7 circling. Over the 4-hour observation period, not one landed. They maintained altitude and circled with the specific economy of birds working a thermal above a food source, but they did not descend. He logged this in 15-minute entries. 7:45, 7 vultures, altitude maintained. 9 vultures, no descent. 10:15, 11 vultures, no change. He noted that he had observed vultures descend to a standard coyote kill within 40 minutes on 2 occasions the prior spring, and that an 11-bird column holding altitude for 4 hours over a food source with no descent was, to his knowledge, without a documented parallel in the predation ecology literature. The coyotes were more informative. He counted 4 separate approach events over the 4 hours. In each case, the animal stopped at roughly 30 yards from the carcasses, circled the perimeter, and withdrew. On the 3rd approach, at just after 10 in the morning, the coyote sat at the 30-yard mark for 11 minutes before leaving. He described it as sitting the way a dog sits when it is not sure what to do. Upright, attentive, not relaxed, not alarmed, in the specific posture of an animal that has received a signal it does not know how to act on. He brought this observation to a predation ecology seminar he ran at NMSU in 2003, presenting it anonymously as a field observation from livestock mortality data without attribution. He asked the seminar group to propose mechanisms for consistent scavenger avoidance of an ungulate carcass. The discussion identified several candidates: an unusual chemical compound in the tissue, a pathogen that some predators and scavengers can detect and avoid, an immune response producing volatile compounds during post-mortem decomposition. He had, across the full data set, noted one physical anomaly that might bear on the chemistry: the carcass temperature. In 12 cases across the dataset where he arrived within 2 hours of the estimated kill time, he measured the core body temperature of the carcasses using a probe thermometer, standard post-mortem thermodynamics for an animal the size of a Rambouillet ewe in a high desert environment would show core temperature declining at approximately 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit per hour, converging on ambient temperature over the course of 8 to 12 hours. His measurements showed core temperature running 6 to 8 degrees above ambient at 2 to 4 hours post-mortem, which is elevated relative to what the standard cooling curve predicts. In 2 cases where he was able to return to the site 8 hours after his initial measurement, core temperature was still above ambient by 3 to 4 degrees. He has no explanation for this. He included it in the data because he measured it, and recording measurements is what you do. He brought the temperature data to the seminar as well. The seminar group found it interesting and did not resolve it. Felix Trujillo. Felix Trujillo has run sheep on 3,000 acres in western Otero County for 35 years. His grandfather homesteaded the land in the 1930s. His father expanded the operation in the 1960s, and Felix took it over in his early 30s and has run it since with the kind of methodical incrementalism that multi-generational operations tend toward. He is not a man who keeps approximate records. He keeps a paper ledger in a fireproof box in the barn office that goes back to his first year on the property, and in that ledger is every livestock loss, date, age, and weight of the animal, cause of death, any unusual circumstances. He showed the ledger to Pruitt the first time Pruitt drove out, in 1999, responding to a report from the Otero County Extension Office about a cluster of unexplained sheep deaths on the upper pasture. The ledger is a large format columnar pad, the kind accountants used before electronic records, and Felix Trujillo has been using the same brand since his first year on the property. Each page has 7 columns: date, animal ID by ear tag number, age, weight at last measurement, cause of death, location on property, and notes. The handwriting is small and consistent, the kind of handwriting that comes from years of entering the same categories of information and has compressed itself to fit the available space efficiently. Pruitt spent an afternoon with the ledger on his first visit, going back through the entries from 99 to the beginning, and he found 3 prior entries that matched the anomalous wound profile in summers of 95, 96, and 98 respectively. All 3 had the cause of death column filled in as unknown, wound at throat, and the notes column read, on all 3, no blood. Felix Trujillo had been recording bloodless kills in a columnar ledger for 4 years before he called anyone. Pruitt asked him why he had not reported earlier, and Trujillo looked at him for a moment and said, "I figured somebody already knew about it." He had assumed, without examining the assumption, that the State Wildlife Agency was aware of a predator in the Sacramento Mountains that drained livestock without leaving blood and had simply decided not to address it. Pruitt did not correct him on that point. The upper pasture is a roughly 200-acre section of Felix Trujillo's property that sits at 6,200 feet, in the same general area as the 89 Sacramento Mountains case. When Pruitt arrived in the summer of '99 and walked the pasture with Trujillo, he recognized the terrain immediately from his prior documentation. He had been here, or close to it, 20 years ago. The kill signature was the same. Pruitt and Trujillo worked together, in the sense of Pruitt documenting and Trujillo providing access and records, for 6 years. Over that period from 1999 through 2004, Felix Trujillo lost 47 sheep to predation of various kinds. 22 of the 47 showed the anomalous wound profile. The remaining 25 were standard mountain lion and coyote losses, documented as such. The 22 anomalous kills occurred exclusively in the window from late June through mid-August, every year for 6 consecutive years. They occurred in the same section of the upper pasture, within a roughly 40-acre area on the northeast edge, closest to the tree line. Pruitt documented each of the 22 carefully. He had stopped submitting anomalous tissue samples to the NMDGF lab by this point, after the '89 experience and the subsequent retention policy response. He photographed the wounds, measured them, recorded the scene conditions, and put everything in the dedicated log. He could no longer generate laboratory analysis to attach to the case. He could generate documentation. He told me what the experience of those 6 years was like from his side. He knew by the second year what the summer pattern on that property would look like. He knew what he would find when the phone rang from the extension office in July. He drove up from Las Cruces, where he had moved when he joined the NMSU faculty, through the desert, up the elevation, into the mountain country, and out to the Trujillo property, and he documented kills that he had essentially been expecting. He said the experience of that kind of prediction, of knowing what you are going to find before you arrive, has 2 faces. On one side, it is the professional confirmation that the pattern is real and repeatable. On the other side, it is something harder to name, the feeling of watching a thing happen that you cannot intervene in because you cannot yet account for it in terms that would permit a formal response. Trujillo, for his part, made a calculation. He told Pruitt in 2002 that he had stopped moving his sheep off the upper pasture in summer. The grass on that section of the property was too productive to sacrifice. If he let it sit unworked through the high-growth months, brush encroachment would reduce its forage value by fall, and he would lose the pasture to scrub within a few years. He ran the expected summer losses against the value of the forage and found they balanced closely enough that he could absorb them. He took the losses and kept the pasture. He mentioned once, in 2003, something that he had not included in the ledger because it was not a mortality event. One afternoon in late July, he had been checking water in the upper pasture near dusk, and the sheep that were grazing the northeast section had done something he had not seen them do before. They had stopped moving, all of them, all at once, the way animals sometimes stop when they hear a sound that has not reached a human ear yet. They were standing with their heads up, and they were not looking in the same direction, which is what a group alert response to a specific threat looks like. They were looking in different directions, as if the stimulus was not localized. They stood that way for approximately 2 minutes, and then they began moving normally again. He had seen nothing in the tree line, and he had heard nothing. He finished checking water and drove back to the barn. He stopped cooperating with Pruitt's documentation visits after 2004. He did not explain why directly. His wife later mentioned to Pruitt, in passing, that Felix had decided he did not want more attention on the upper pasture after a summer where a 2-day documentation visit had coincided with the highest single-season anomalous loss count in the 6-year record. Whether he connected those 2 events causally or coincidentally, Pruitt did not know. He has not pursued the question, and Trujillo has not sought him out. Elena Santillan. In March of 2002, a goat rancher in Dona Ana County named Elena Santillan reported 4 boar-cross goats dead on a Saturday morning. She kept a small herd, 60 animals on 5 acres at the base of the Organ Mountains east of Las Cruces, and she had not experienced a predation loss in 4 years of operation. She did not know Garrison Pruitt and had not contacted his office. She had called the county extension office, which routed the report to the NMDGF district, which forwarded it to Pruitt as the regional contact for unusual predation cases. He drove out that afternoon. She had left the carcasses undisturbed, which was useful. He documented 4 kills with the standard wound profile. He noted the kill site conditions: no blood, no disturbed soil, no evidence of a fence breach on the wire enclosure surrounding the herd's sleeping area. He asked her about the previous night. She had heard nothing. She had a mixed breed dog, a medium-sized animal she described as reactive to disturbance, and the dog had also heard nothing, or at any rate had not barked. She said she had smelled something when she went out to feed, before she found the dead animals. She described it as sharp and chemical and unlike any animal smell she associated with her property. She reached for a reference and found one, the smell near an electrical transformer on her street in El Paso when she was growing up, after a power surge. sharp and acrid with something beneath it that she associated, without being able to say exactly why, with heat. He put that in his notes. Sulfur with a chemical or ozone component was how 2 other ranchers in his dataset had tried to describe it, and the transformer comparison was the closest anyone had come to articulating the secondary note he had detected himself at the Animas Valley site in '81. The case was notable for something beyond the individual incident. Its location was the southernmost and easternmost spring case in his dataset, Donna Ana County, the eastern edge near the Organ Mountains, March. On his map, it sat below the rest of the spring cluster, a clear outlier in both geography and elevation. The Organ Mountains foothills are at roughly 4,000 feet, lower than any of the other spring cases. Its presence moved the southern anchor point of the spring arrival pattern 40 miles south and east of where he had previously placed it. He revised the working map of the circuit after documenting it. What it suggested was that the northward spring movement did not begin in the Sacramento Mountains foothills, as he had assumed, but at a lower elevation, possibly tracking the eastern edge of the Organ Mountains before climbing into the higher country to the north. The circuit was larger and more southerly in its origin point than he had been drawing it. The 2007 paper. He and Carla Mendenhall, who had completed her MS in Applied Statistics at NMSU and was working in the Department of Animal and Range Sciences, wrote up the spatial analysis for publication over the course of about 18 months. The finished paper was titled Spatial and Temporal Clustering of Anomalous Livestock Predation Events in the Chihuahuan Desert Bioregion, 1979 to 2006. It was submitted to the Southwestern Naturalist, the peer-reviewed journal of the Southwestern Association of Naturalists, which covers vertebrate biology across the American Southwest and adjacent Mexico. The journal accepted it with revisions. The revisions were specific. The reviewers asked Pruitt to remove a passage from the discussion section in which he had noted that the spatial clustering pattern and its seasonal directionality were consistent with altitudinal migration behavior in a mun, large-bodied mammal of unknown species, and suggested that field surveys targeted at the spring and fall transitional portions of the corridor might be productive for direct observation of the causal organism. The reviewers found this language too far beyond what the data directly supported. The data showed clustering and directionality. It did not establish the identity of the organism. Pruitt removed the passage and resubmitted. The paper was accepted and published in the journal's 4th quarterly issue of 2007. The paper as published is measured and precise. It describes the wound morphology in clinical terms, presents the spatial clustering analysis with full statistical notation, confirms directional temporal pattern in the distribution, and concludes that the causal agent remains undetermined. It does not speculate. It does not suggest. It lays out what 40 years of careful data collection established and stops there. He has the paper framed on the wall of his study. In the 14 years since publication, it has been cited by 4 other researchers. 3 citations are for Mendenhall's spatial autocorrelation methodology, applied to entirely unrelated livestock predation studies. 1 citation is in a paper about economic impacts of livestock depredation in the Chihuahuan Desert region, which uses his kill count data as a baseline comparison. Nobody has cited it for the causal question. The paper exists in the literature, the way a careful question exists in a room when nobody is willing to answer it. I asked him whether that surprised him. He looked at the framed paper for a moment. He said, "The paper describes an anomaly and declines to explain it. Papers that describe anomalies without resolving them do not attract citation. If I had published a paper claiming to resolve it, that would have gotten attention, and also it would have been dishonest, because the data does not resolve it. So I published what the data supports, and it sits where it sits, the gap years. Across 40 years, there are 3 multi-year periods when the anomalous cases in Pruitt's coverage area essentially stop. The first gap runs from 1986 through 1988, 3 years, during which he documented no cases matching the wound profile from anywhere in his coverage area. The second gap runs from 1997 through 98, 2 years. The third runs from 2010 through 2012, again 3 years, before a single case appeared in late 2012 in Hidalgo County, and the pattern resumed. He walked me through his explanations for the gaps, which he offers without preference for any of them. 1. The animal or animals shifted their territory or movement route during those periods in a direction outside his coverage area, and kills occurred elsewhere but outside his data. 2. The gap years represent a biological pause, a reproductive or denning period during which activity is suppressed, analogous to the reduced predation rates seen in large carnivores during denning season. 3. The gaps are a data artifact, meaning the kills continued but went unreported during those specific windows. He considers the third explanation least likely. His rancher network was active and communicative during all 3 gap periods, and the ranchers who had reported anomalous cases before each gap reported nothing during them. He does not have an answer. He told me that the gap years are the part of the data set he has spent the most time with and gotten the least out of. Every explanation he has is consistent with the data, and none of them is forced by the data. He has sat with that ambiguity for long enough that he has stopped expecting it to resolve. He keeps the gap years in the documentation because removing them would falsify the record, and because absences, in a dataset built over 4 decades, are as informative as presences, even when you cannot yet say what they are informing you of. He described what the first gap felt like from inside it. From 86 through 88, 3 full years, he continued making the rounds, driving the 2-track to the ranches in his coverage area, checking in with the informal network of contacts he had built, asking the same questions he always asked. Nothing came back. The ranchers he spoke to had not experienced the wound profile losses during those years. He expanded his inquiry in the 2nd year, reaching out to contacts in Grant County to the north and in Donna Ana County to the south, asking whether anyone had seen anything unusual. Nothing from either direction. By the 3rd year of the gap, he was beginning to wonder, in the way a scientist wonders when the data stops, whether the pattern had been real at all, whether the previous 6 years of anomalous cases had been the artifact he was consciously trying to rule out. He had 26 documented cases in 6 years and then 3 years of nothing, and the nothing had a way of pressing back on the preceding something, making it feel less solid. Then, in March of '89, a rancher in Sierra County called to report 3 goats dead with no blood at sight, and Pruitt drove out and found the wound profile again, exactly as he had documented it in 26 prior cases, unchanged. He sat in the truck in the rancher's driveway for a few minutes after the documentation was done before he drove back. He did not write anything about what he felt in the dedicated log. He wrote the case number, the coordinates, and the wound description. That is what field logs are for. The 3rd gap, 2010 through 2012, is the one I want to stop on for a moment. I came to Las Cruces having already spent time with documentation from another source, a wildlife services field specialist who had spent 14 months documenting anomalous livestock kills across Val Verde, Edwards, and Kinney counties in southwest Texas. The Texas case cluster ran from March of 2010 through May of 2011, which overlaps the first 2 years of Pruitt's 3rd gap almost exactly. I did not identify my source or share the documentation. I described the case in broad terms: the wound signature, the kill count, the time period, the geographic location, and I watched Garrison Pruitt listen to it. He went into the study and came back with his dedicated log. He opened it to the 2010 through 2012 section and set it on the table in front of me. The pages for that period had 2 entries in 2010, both standard coyote predation. The 2011 pages were blank. 1 entry in late 2012, resuming the prior wound profile in Hidalgo County. He set the log down. He said, "Where, exactly, is the Texas cluster?" I told him, "Val Verde County, north to Edwards County and east to Kinney County, southwest Texas, east of the Pecos River." He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the GIS print on the table and traced the eastern edge of his coverage area with 1 finger. That edge runs through the Sacramento Mountains and south through Donna Ana County to the border. East of that line is Texas, 150 miles to Val Verde County, and further to Edwards and Kinney. He said, "That is east of what I have covered. If you extended the eastern boundary of the corridor I have mapped, Val Verde County is roughly where you would get to." He traced the potential extension on the map with his finger, not pressing, just indicating the direction. He said, "My corridor may be narrower than the actual territory. If there is a range extension that occurs in some years, or a population that uses a different portion of the circuit in some years, the eastern arm of that would be in Texas. I would not see it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I have been thinking of this as a corridor for 40 years. It may be considerably larger than that." He has no Texas data. He has never worked in Texas. The two datasets have not been formally compared, and he cannot be the person to compare them because he does not have access to the other. But the geometry of it sat in the room between us for a while. He stood at the table looking at the map for what I estimated was 2 or 3 minutes without speaking. His expression did not change in any way I could read. He has the face of a man who has spent decades processing uncomfortable information without the luxury of reacting to it. Finally, he said, "Did the wound profile match what I have described to you?" I told him yes. Bilateral punctures, same diameter, same exsanguination pattern, same scavenger avoidance, same sulfur smell reported independently by ranchers who had no contact with each other or with his documentation. He nodded slowly. He said, "And 14 months, you said, a distinct cluster across 3 counties, and then it stopped." I said yes. Spring of 2010 through early 2011. He looked at the eastern edge of his map again. He said, "That is 2 years before the pattern resumed in Hidalgo County. If you add the 14 months to a few months of transition movement from Texas back into New Mexico, the timing is consistent." He tapped the map. He said, "I have been assuming the gap years meant the activity stopped. It may mean the activity moved to a place I was not looking." He did not say anything else about it immediately. He went to refill his coffee and stayed in the kitchen for a moment. When he came back to the table, he said, "This is the first time I have had any external corroboration of any part of this dataset in 40 years. He said it without particular emotion, which I found more striking than if he had said it with some, the one time in 37 years. It was October of 2003. He was in the Lincoln National Forest buffer zone in Otero County, on a hillside above the Trujillo property, doing a post-kill site survey following a summer of documentation there. It was late afternoon. He estimated 4:30 or 5 o'clock, the light going orange and low across the cedar country below him. He had a Kowa spotting scope with a 77mm objective, which is a scope a serious field biologist uses for extended distance observation, and he was glassing a shallow cedar valley below his position looking for movement. He had it in the scope for 8 seconds. He counted, because the discipline of a field observer when encountering an unfamiliar subject is to time the observation precisely, so you know how much weight the description can carry when you write it down. 8 seconds. He could see an animal approximately the size of a large dog or small mountain lion at the shoulder, moving quadrupedally at the far edge of a cedar stand, roughly 750 to 800 yards away. The proportions were wrong for any animal he could place. The limb articulation was wrong. The joints bent at angles that did not correspond to any quadruped's normal locomotion, as if the limbs had more articulation points than expected, or the angles of those points were inverted from what he was used to seeing. The head was disproportionately large and round. At the distance and light level available, he could not detect a fur coat, and the surface appeared smooth, though he allowed that the light conditions at that distance would not permit fine surface detail. There was no visible ear structure. He is not a person who overstates what he saw. He said, "At 800 yards in fading afternoon light through a 77mm scope, you establish proportions and movement, not fine anatomy. What I can tell you with confidence is that the proportions were wrong and the movement was wrong. Those are 2 things I can stand behind." The animal moved into the cedar cover, and he did not see it again. He glassed the valley for 40 minutes. He went down into the draw before dark and found nothing. No footprints he could identify. No hair on the cedar branches. No disturbed ground. He walked back up to the outcrop and sat with the scope for another 20 minutes. In his field log that night, he wrote 1 paragraph. The time, the bearing, the estimated distance, the description of what he had seen, the duration of the observation. He wrote nothing interpretive. He told me that the following morning, after he had slept on it, he added 1 line at the bottom of the entry. Observation consistent with target organism. Confirmation not possible at distance and light conditions. That log entry has not been shared with anyone before our conversation. He did not file it with the district office or include it in any academic or professional communication. It is one line at the bottom of a field entry in a notebook in his study, and it is the only place in 37 years of documentation where he put his own observation into the record. I asked him whether seeing it in the scope changed anything for him, practically or otherwise. He thought about this for a long time before answering. He said that it clarified the project without changing the method. He had built the data set on rancher reports and wound documentation because those were the things he could put in a formal record. One brief sighting at 800 yards in poor light could not go in a formal record in any meaningful way. What it did was confirm for him that the data set was documenting a real organism and not an artifact of reporting bias or wound misidentification. He had believed that before October of 2003. He believed it more specifically afterward. The work continued the same way it had before, the 2001 submission. When Pruitt moved from NMDGF to NMSU faculty in 2001, he prepared a summary of his anomalous case documentation and submitted it to the State Wildlife Management Division. It was not the full dedicated log, which he had been keeping privately since the early years. It was a 3-page summary describing the case count, the geographic coverage, the consistent wound morphology, the spatial clustering, and the seasonal pattern. He recommended that the division either assign a specialist to continue formal monitoring of the anomalous cases or forward the summary to a federal agency with broader monitoring capacity. The division responded 3 months later. The response acknowledged the summary and said it would be reviewed internally. It asked whether he had additional documentation supporting the wound morphology findings, specifically laboratory analysis. He replied that he had submitted tissue samples in several cases and provided the relevant case reference numbers. The division replied that those cases showed as inactive in the record system and that the applicable retention periods had passed. He did not submit anything further to the division after that exchange. He did not approach any federal agency. He kept the full documentation in the dedicated log, continued adding cases from field observation, and let the state record stay where it was. He told me he has had colleagues over the years at NMSU who have asked in general terms what he was working on. He described the anomalous predation project to 2 of them at different points, without going into the detail of the documentation. Both responded with the kind of interest that does not translate into action. They found it intriguing, suggested he write it up, and moved on to their own work. He did write it up. He published it in 2007. Neither colleague cited it. He does not carry resentment about this. It is a description of how science works when the phenomenon being described does not fit neatly into existing categories. Reviewers ask you to remove the interpretive conclusion. Colleagues find it interesting but not compelling, and the paper accumulates 4 citations in 14 years. He has published work on pronghorn habitat use that has 42 citations. That is how the field processes information. He is not surprised by it, and he is not bitter about it. He is 72 years old, and he has seen his data and what it shows, and those 2 things are not changed by the citation count. What Pruitt carries. On my last afternoon in Las Cruces, after 3 days at his kitchen table with the maps and 2 evenings talking in his study, I asked him what 40 years of this had meant to him as a person, not as a biologist. Not what the data showed, not what the patterns implied, but what he had carried from it. He looked at the maps for a while. He said, "This region has been occupied by human beings for at least 12,000 years. The Animas Valley has archaeological sites from the Paleo-Indian period. Whatever is on those maps has been moving through this terrain for the full length of my documentation, and almost certainly much longer, given what Pauline Archuleta's family had been calling the losses for decades before I showed up. It is not a recent arrival to this part of the world. It has been here long enough to establish a route, maintain it, and use it at a level of efficiency that has kept it below the threshold of formal recognition for as long as anyone has been keeping records." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The people who ranched this country earliest, before there were county extension offices or state wildlife agencies or anything like a formal reporting structure, had a name for the losses. Los que no sangran. They did not have a formal response to it either, because there was no formal response available to them. What they had was a name that acknowledged the thing without pretending to explain it. I think about that name sometimes. It is accurate. It is what I have. Documentation that acknowledges the thing, not an explanation. He stood up and went to make coffee. He came back and set a cup in front of me and sat down and looked at the maps again for a while without saying anything. He has made arrangements for the full documentation, the dedicated log, the maps, and the 40 years of field photographs to go to a specific person after his death. He did not tell me who that person is. He said only that it is someone who will know what to do with it. He is in good health. He gardens. He tracks the pronghorn that passed through the Donna Ana County desert visible from his back porch, watching them through a scope on the early mornings when the light is good. He told me that watching the pronghorn move through the same country in their own seasonal pattern, which is documented and understood and fits without remainder into the existing literature, is something he finds clarifying. It is what migration looks like when you know what is doing it. He did not say what migration looks like when you do not. I drove south on Interstate 25 out of Las Cruces, the Franklin Mountains rising across the windshield as the city fell away, the Chihuahuan Desert spreading flat and dry in all directions. It was April and warm. Somewhere behind me, in the Sacramento Mountains or the Black Range, or moving up through the Otero County foothills toward the high country, the spring pattern that Pruitt's maps document was, if the previous 40 years are any indication, already in motion. I thought about the 91 red marks on his kitchen table, about the shape they make together when you step back far enough to stop seeing the individual incidents and start seeing what they build. About a word he has never written in a field log. About Pauline Archuleta in the Animas Valley, before Pruitt was out of graduate school, calling the losses something her family had been calling them for as long as anyone could remember. The paper from 2007 is in the Southwestern Naturalist Archives, available to anyone who looks for it. The tissue samples from the '89 Sacramento Mountains case are gone. The 40 years of field logs and photographs are in a fireproof cabinet in a house in Las Cruces, and the person who has made arrangements for them has not told me who will receive them. He said he will be in touch if anything changes. I did not ask him what he thought was likely to change.